Look around at any given moment of your day, and you will find noise. It is not just the noise of traffic or notifications buzzing against your leg in your pocket. It is deeper than that. It is the noise of other people's expectations pressing against your own sense of who you are supposed to be. It is the noise of comparison, scrolling through curated lives and measuring your unaided one against them. It is the noise of uncertainty about the future, the noise of regret about the past, and the noise of 1,000 small decisions that all seem to matter enormously in the moment they arrive. We have built entire societies, entire economies, around capturing and holding your attention, and the natural result is a mind that rarely gets to rest. Most people have quietly accepted this as simply what life is now, an endless hum of urgency that they have no choice but to live inside. But here is the distinction that changes everything. Chaos is a condition of the world, while calm is a capacity of the mind. These are not the same thing, and confusing them is where so much unnecessary suffering begins. The world was chaotic in ancient Rome too. Wars were fought, emperors were assassinated, plagues swept through cities, fortunes were lost overnight, and people were exiled or executed on the whims of those in power. The external chaos of that era was, in many ways, far more severe than anything most of us will ever face. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, certain people found a way to remain steady. Not because their circumstances improved, but because they had trained something inside themselves that the chaos could not reach. This is the heart of the first keynote. Your peace does not have to wait for the world to become peaceful. If it did, none of us would ever find it, because the world has never been calm, and it never will be. There will always be another crisis, another deadline, another piece of bad news, another person who disappoints you, another moment that threatens to knock you off balance. If your calm is dependent on none of these things happening, you have handed the keys to your own mind over to forces entirely outside your control. That is a fragile way to live, and deep down, most people sense this fragility even if they cannot name it. It shows up as a low hum of anxiety that never fully goes away, a sense that stability is always one bad phone call away from collapsing. What the Stoics understood, and what this entire framework is built upon, is that calm is trainable. It is not a personality trait that some people are lucky enough to be born with, while the rest of us are doomed to anxiety. It is closer to a muscle, something built through repetition, through the deliberate practice of separating what happens to you from how you choose to respond to it. This is not about suppressing emotion or pretending that hardship does not hurt. It is about recognizing that between the event and your reaction to it, there is a space, and in that space lies your power. Most people never notice that space exists. They live as though the event and the reaction are fused together, as though anger or panic or despair is simply the automatic, unavoidable output of whatever happened to them. But if that were true, everyone who faced the same circumstance would react identically, and we know that is not the case. Two people can lose their job on the same day, and one collapses into despair, while the other treats it as the opening of an unexpected door. The difference is not the event. The difference is the trained response. This is why the phrase, "from chaos to calm," is not a promise to remove chaos from your life. No principle, no philosophy, no amount of discipline will ever fully quiet the world around you. What is on offer instead is something far more valuable and far more permanent: the ability to walk through that same unchanged, unpredictable, often difficult world while carrying a center of gravity that does not tip over with every gust of wind. That center is built deliberately, principle by principle, choice by choice, and it is available to you regardless of what today, tomorrow, or next year decides to throw in your direction. There is a particular kind of skepticism that arises whenever someone mentions a philosophy that is over 2,000 years old. The assumption is that anything from antiquity must be quaint at best and irrelevant at worst, fit for a museum display or a university seminar, but not for the actual mess of modern life, with its inboxes and mortgages and algorithms and existential dread delivered in push notifications. This skepticism is understandable, but it rests on a mistaken assumption that human nature itself has changed as much as human technology has. It has not. We still feel fear when we face uncertainty. We still feel anger when we believe we have been wronged. We still grieve loss, crave approval, resent unfairness, and struggle to accept things we cannot change. The operating system of the human mind has remained remarkably consistent, even as the hardware surrounding it has been utterly transformed. This is precisely why the people who built Stoic philosophy are worth listening to. Not despite the fact that they lived so long ago, but because of what they lived through while they were doing the thinking. Consider that one of the most important Stoic voices belonged to a man who spent years in slavery, stripped of legal personhood, subject to the will of another human being in every practical sense. He did not write his philosophy from a place of comfort or privilege. He wrote it while asking the most urgent question a person in his position could ask: what remains free in me, even when everything else has been taken? Consider another voice, a statesman who accumulated enormous wealth and influence, only to watch it collapse around him, who was forced into exile, and who eventually faced execution at the order of a former student turned tyrant, and by most historical accounts, met that fate with more composure than most of us bring to a delayed flight. And consider a third voice, perhaps the most surprising of all, a man who held more power than almost anyone alive during his lifetime, commanding the largest military force in the known world, yet who wrote private journal entries, never intended for publication, wrestling with grief, self-doubt, frustration, and the exhausting weight of responsibility. These were not abstract theorists, constructing tidy arguments in comfortable studies. These were people under real pressure, working out real answers, because the alternative was psychological collapse. This is what separates Stoicism from a great deal of other historical philosophy that has faded into academic irrelevance. It was never meant to be an intellectual exercise for its own sake. It was designed from its origins as a practical discipline, something closer to training than theory. The Stoics were less interested in debating the nature of the universe for its own sake and far more interested in a single, urgent question: how should a person live, given that hardship is guaranteed and control is limited? That question has not aged a single day. If anything, it has become more urgent, because modern life has generated new and more sophisticated forms of the same old problems. The specific stressors have changed. We worry about email response times instead of grain shortages, about social media validation instead of standing in the forum. But the underlying psychological mechanics are identical. The anxious mind pacing over an uncertain future, the wounded ego bristling at criticism, the exhausted spirit worn down by things it cannot fix. These are the same patterns Marcus Aurelius wrestled with in his tent between military campaigns, the same patterns Epictetus with his students, the same patterns Seneca examined in letters to his friends. The costume has changed. The character underneath has not. This is why treating Stoicism as an artifact to be studied, rather than a tool to be used, is a fundamental misreading of what it actually is. It was never meant to sit on a shelf. It was built to be picked up and used in the middle of a difficult conversation, In the moment before a hard decision, in the quiet hours, when anxiety refuses to let you sleep. The relevance of these 12 principles does not come from clever branding or a trendy repackaging of old ideas for a modern audience. It comes from the simple and slightly humbling fact that human beings, despite every technological leap we have made, still have not solved the basic problem of how to live well when life is hard. The ancient world offers no magic fix for this, but it does offer something valuable: the accumulated, tested, hard, won insight of people who thought carefully about this exact problem and left behind a working record of what actually helped. If you trace almost every moment of anxiety, frustration, or despair back to its root, you will usually find the same structural error hiding underneath it. A person directing their emotional energy towards something they cannot actually change, while neglecting the one thing they always could. This is not a minor oversight. It is, according to the Stoics, the single most common and most costly mistake a human mind makes, repeated daily in ways so habitual we rarely even notice we are doing it. We worry about what other people think of us, a thing we cannot control. We replay decisions from years ago, wishing we could edit a past that no longer exists to be edited. We obsess over outcomes. Whether we will get the job, whether the diagnosis will be good news, whether the relationship will last, when the outcome itself sits entirely outside our hands, shaped by countless variables we never had access to in the first place. And all the while, the one thing that was always within our grasp, our own judgment, effort, and response, goes largely unattended, as if it were the least important variable in the equation, rather than the only one that ever truly belonged to us. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, and it is treated as close to a foundational law of psychological physics. Some things are up to us: our opinions, our intentions, our effort, our reactions, the character we choose to display under pressure. Everything else, other people's opinions, the weather, the economy, our reputation, our health in any ultimate sense, whether someone loves us back, whether we are remembered well after we are gone, is not up to us. It may be influenced by us, nudged slightly in one direction or another by our actions, but it is never fully within our command. The moment you invest your peace of mind in something from that second category, you have essentially handed control of your emotional state to forces you cannot direct. You have made your happiness contingent on the cooperation of the uncooperative universe. This is not a strategy. It is closer to a wager you are guaranteed to lose eventually, because the universe was never obligated to arrange itself according to your preferences. What makes this principle so quietly radical is that it does not ask you to stop caring about outcomes altogether, nor does it ask you to become passive or indifferent to your circumstances. That would be a serious misreading of the idea, and it is one of the most common ones. The Stoics were not advocating for resignation. Marcus Aurelius did not stop leading his empire because outcomes were uncertain. Epictetus did not stop teaching because he could not guarantee his students would listen. What this principle asks instead is a redirection of where your emotional stake is placed. Put your full effort, attention, and care into your actions, your preparation, your integrity, and your response, because those genuinely are yours to shape. Then, once that effort has been given honestly and completely, release your grip on the outcome, because gripping it tighter changes nothing about what happens next. It only exhausts you in the waiting. Think about how much of daily suffering actually follows this exact pattern once you start looking for it. The nervousness before a job interview is rarely about the effort you put into preparing. It is about whether the interviewer will like you, a variable you cannot fully engineer. The dread before checking test results is rarely about whether you did what you could to stay healthy. It is about the verdict itself, which biology will deliver on its own terms, regardless of how much you worry about it beforehand. The anger at a driver who cut you off is rarely productive, because their behavior was never within your jurisdiction to begin with. Only your response to it was. Once you begin sorting your daily frustrations into these two piles, controllable and uncontrollable, something shifts. A significant portion of what used to feel like an emergency requiring your full anxious attention gets revealed as noise that was never actually yours to carry. What remains is a much smaller, much more manageable pile: your own choices, your own effort, your own character. And that pile, unlike the other one, is something you can actually do something about, starting immediately, without needing permission or cooperation from anyone or anything else. There is a natural temptation when someone tells you there are 12 principles to learn to treat the number itself as the obstacle. 12 can sound like a syllabus, a checklist to be memorized, and then forgotten a week later. The way so much self-improvement content gets consumed in a single sitting and evaporates by the following Tuesday. But the structure of 12 principles was never meant to function as a list. It was meant to function as a path, and the distinction between those two things matters more than it might first appear. A list is something you check off. A path is something you walk, and walking implies movement, sequence, and change happening to you along the way, not simply information being deposited into your memory for later recall. Consider what actually happens when a person begins to internalize the earlier principles, the ones about separating what is within their control from what is not, or recognizing that their judgments about events shape their suffering more than the events themselves. Those ideas do not stay contained in their own neat little box. They start to bleed into everything else. Once you have genuinely absorbed the idea that your reactions belong to you and are not simply forced upon you by circumstance, you cannot know that when you arrive at a later principle about facing obstacles or embracing discipline, the earlier insight becomes the foundation the later one stands on. This is why the 12 principles were never meant to be encountered as isolated, interchangeable modules that could be studied in any order, like items on a menu. They build. Each one assumes the ground laid by what came before it, and each one prepares the ground for what comes after. Remove one from the middle and the structure above it becomes noticeably less stable. The way a staircase missing a step still technically gets you upward, but at a cost of stumbling that was entirely avoidable. This is also why the promise attached to these 12 principles is not modest. It is not framed as 12 tips for a slightly better Tuesday, or 12 quotes to make you feel briefly inspired before returning unchanged to your old patterns. It is framed as a transformation, and that word is chosen deliberately rather than for dramatic effect. A transformation implies that the person who finishes the journey is meaningfully different from the person who began it. Not because they have accumulated more facts, but because something in how they process the world has actually shifted. Anyone can learn a fact and remain entirely unchanged by it. You can know, intellectually, that comparison steals contentment, and continue comparing yourself to others every single day regardless. Facts alone rarely rewire behavior. What creates change is the accumulated weight of principles applied consistently over time, tested against real frustrations and real setbacks, until what began as an idea you read about becomes a reflex you no longer have to consciously summon. This is precisely why 12 is not an arbitrary number, chosen for the sake of a tidy structure, but a reflection of how much ground actually needs to be covered for a complete transformation to take root. A single principle, however powerful, addresses a single vulnerability. But human beings are complicated, and our suffering rarely comes from just one source. We need help with our judgments, yes, but we also need help with our fear of what others think, our tendency toward anger, our resistance to accepting what we cannot change, our relationship with mortality, our understanding of what genuine strength actually looks like under pressure. Each principle addresses a different vulnerability, a different way that chaos finds its way into an unprepared mind. Skip too many of them, and you are left with a philosophy full of gaps, strong in the areas it covers and defenseless in the areas it does not. What this means practically is that patience with the process matters more than enthusiasm for any single principle in isolation. It is tempting to hear the first or second idea, feel a jolt of recognition, and assume the work is essentially done. But a powerful and meaningful life is not built from a single insight, however striking that insight might feel in the moment it lands. It is built from the slow, cumulative layering of many insights, each reinforcing the others, until the person standing at the end of the 12th principle possesses something the person who started at the first one simply did not have: a genuinely different relationship with chaos itself, built not on a single clever idea, but on an entire architecture of thought, tested and reinforced from every angle a difficult life is likely to attack. There is a meaningful difference between information that changes what you know and information that changes what you do, and almost everyone in modern life has experienced both categories often enough to recognize the gap between them. You can read 100 articles about the importance of sleep and still stay up too late scrolling. You can understand, in full intellectual detail, why exercise matters and still skip it for months at a time. Knowledge, by itself, has a strange and humbling limitation. It rarely moves the body or reshapes daily behavior on its own. It sits in the mind as something true, admired even while life continues on exactly as it did before the knowledge arrived. This is the quiet failure mode of so much education and so much self-improvement content in general. It succeeds at making people more informed while leaving them almost entirely unchanged in how they actually live. This is precisely the trap that a discussion of Stoicism could easily fall into, and it is worth naming directly rather than pretending the risk does not exist. It would be entirely possible to walk through 12 fascinating historical facts about Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, to explain the dichotomy of control with great clarity, to trace the philosophical lineage from ancient Greece through Rome, and to leave an audience nodding along, intellectually satisfied, having learned something interesting about the ancient world, and then to watch every single person return to their normal life, completely unchanged by any of it. That outcome would represent a genuine failure, not because the information shared would be inaccurate, but because information was never actually the point. The Stoics themselves would have been the first to object to this kind of outcome. They were famously impatient with philosophy that stayed abstract, that turned into clever debate for its own sake, that produced articulate speakers who could discuss virtue beautifully while living lives that bore no resemblance to what they described. Epictetus in particular was blunt about this, insisting repeatedly that a student who could recite philosophical arguments but could not control their anger had learned nothing of any real value. So the aim here is not simply to leave you more knowledgeable about an interesting historical philosophy, able to mention Marcus Aurelius at a dinner party with newfound confidence. The aim is to leave you different in some small but real way by the time this is finished. More equipped to handle the specific moment, later today or next week, when chaos actually arrives at your door in whatever form it tends to take for you. That is a much higher bar than simply transferring facts, and it changes what this entire experience is asking of you. It is not asking you to sit back and receive information the way you might watch a documentary, absorbing details you find interesting and will mention occasionally in conversation. It is asking you to actively locate yourself inside each principle as it is presented, to ask not, is this historically accurate, but where in my own life does this apply right now, this week? That is a more demanding, more uncomfortable kind of listening because it requires honesty about your own patterns, rather than simply appreciation for someone else's ideas. Consider what this means concretely. When the discussion turns to separating what you can control from what you cannot, the useful response is not simply agreeing that this sounds wise. It is identifying the actual situation in your life right now where you have been exhausting yourself over something that was never yours to control in the first place. A decision someone else made, an outcome still pending, an opinion someone holds about you, that you cannot alter no matter how hard you try. When the discussion turns to obstacles becoming fuel for growth, the useful response is not admiring the idea in the abstract, but naming the specific obstacle currently in front of you and asking what it might be trying to build in you, rather than only what it is costing you. This kind of engagement is harder than passive listening. It requires a willingness to be a little uncomfortable, to admit that some pattern you have been running for years might be exactly the kind of thing these principles are describing. This is ultimately why the framing matters so much, a call to action. Ask something of you that a lecture never does. A lecture ends when the talking stops, and its effects, if any, are left to chance. A call to action assumes that the real work begins the moment the talking stops, not before. And it assumes that the value of everything said up to that point will only be measured by what happens next in your actual, ordinary, chaotic life. That is ultimately why the framing matters so much. A call to action asks something of you that a lecture never does. A lecture ends when the talking stops, and its effects, if any, are left to chance. A call to action assumes that the real work begins the moment the talking stops, not before. And it assumes that the value of everything said up to that point will only be measured by what happens next in your actual, ordinary, chaotic life. So take these 12 principles not as something to admire from a distance, but as something to pick up, carry with you, and put to work. Because a philosophy that only lives in your head has already failed the one test that ever mattered.